They said it was therapy. A new beginning. A cure for pain, for fear, for the mind itself. But in the echo of sterile hallways and the hum of old machines, something else lingered, the sound of people breaking, piece by piece, all in the name of healing. Beat, faint echo of a woman's voice crying out, "Please, no more." The year was 1953. Across the Western world, psychiatry was entering what many called its golden age. War had just ended, soldiers returned home with unseen wounds, and society began asking, what happens when the mind itself becomes the battlefield? Doctors in white coats promised they had the answer. A miracle. A therapy so powerful it could rebuild a person from the ground up. Magazines published smiling photos of patients reborn. Institutions advertised scientific hope for those lost in trauma, depression, or addiction. To the public, it looked like progress. Inside those walls, though, progress took on another meaning. Soft drone, camera pans down a dim corridor. Patients checked involuntarily, ordinary people seeking help, mothers, veterans, students. They were told they'd rest, recover, and leave stronger. But what they walked into was not a hospital. It was a laboratory. Narrator, V.O. The rooms were bright, almost blinding. The floors smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic. Behind each closed door, a person sat, silent, restrained, eyes half open. The doctors spoke in calm tones, their clipboards filled with strange words, depatterning, psychic driving, personality reconfiguration. To the outside world, it was the sound of healing. Inside, it was the systematic unmaking of human identity. Cut to audio distortion, a looped medical voice, "Relax. You are safe. This will help you." We tend to imagine evil as something loud, violent, or impulsive. But sometimes, it wears a white coat. Sometimes, it speaks softly, promising comfort, while taking everything that makes you you. One survivor would later describe it simply, "They didn't fix me. They erased me." But before the truth could surface, before the screams behind the glass were ever heard, the world believed in the promise. Newspapers called it the future of psychiatry. Governments funded it. Hospitals competed to replicate it. And in one quiet corner of a cold northern city, a Scottish-born doctor named Ewan Cameron would become the face of this revolution. He believed he could reprogram the human mind, strip away old habits, erase trauma, and rebuild a new self from the blank slate that remained. It sounded noble. It sounded scientific. But as one of his assistants would later whisper decades after the experiments, we were not healing people. We were deleting them. Sound cue, typewriter clicking, medical machines hum. What happened inside those wards was not a single event, it was a pattern, repeated again and again, hidden under layers of respectability. Even now, the records are incomplete. Names are redacted. Files missing. Some were destroyed. Others locked away under national security. Because what started as therapy would soon become something far more sinister. Beat, faint sound of a heart monitor fading into silence. The story you're about to hear isn't fiction. It isn't rumor. It's what happens when human experimentation hides behind medical ethics. When progress becomes a mask for control. And when people desperate for help become test subjects in a silent war for the human mind. This is not about one hospital. Not about one doctor. It's about an era, when the world believed science could save us from ourselves, and when that faith blinded everyone to the cost. Music darkens, low cello tones, slow breathing sound. The testimonies that remain paint a disturbing picture, nurses instructed to administer drugs without consent. Patients forced to listen to recorded messages for hours, days, weeks. Electroshock used not to cure, but to erase. Memory stripped, identity rewritten, personality flattened into obedience. And yet, through it all, they called it therapy. Whispered echo, "It's for your own good, the survivors who lived through it would never forget the contradiction, the kindness in the doctors' voices as they destroyed what made them human. One nurse later recalled, "They said, 'Don't worry, this will make you better.' But by the end, I didn't know who I was helping anymore, them, or the people they were breaking." Audio cue, door slams shut, lights flicker. Behind each door, a life was rewritten. Behind each file, a person disappeared. And if you think this story ends with exposure and justice, it doesn't. Because the deeper we dig, the more we realize, what began as a miracle cure became a template for something much bigger. Something governments, militaries, and intelligence agencies would quietly watch and fund. But for now, all we know is this: it began with the sound of healing, and ended in silence. The story begins in the ashes of war, a time when the world was desperate to rebuild, not just cities, but minds. In the early 1950s, science had become the new faith. If religion once promised salvation, medicine now promised control. Every headline declared a breakthrough. Every photograph showed smiling doctors standing proudly beside machines of chrome and wire, their hands resting on devices that hummed with electric light. To a generation scarred by World War II, it was comforting to believe that science could heal what the war had broken. But under that optimism, something darker was stirring. Cut to archival shot, hospital exterior, winter fog. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, one man stood at the center of this movement, Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. Brilliant. Charismatic. Respected. To his colleagues, he was the man who could redefine psychiatry itself. To his patients, he was hope made flesh, a voice that promised they would walk out of his hospital free of pain. Cameron had a vision that bordered on divine ambition. He believed the human mind was like a machine, and if it was broken, it could be taken apart and rebuilt. Erase the damage, remove the trauma, clear the slate. Start again. He called this process depatterning. His notes described it clinically, to erase pathological patterns of thought. But beneath the clinical language was something chilling: he wanted to destroy the entire personality of a patient, and then reprogram a new one. Faint pencil writing sound, camera pans over handwritten notes, stage 1, complete psychic deconstruction. At first, his peers were fascinated. Cameron's reputation was impeccable: he had treated royalty, advised governments, and lectured on the future of mental health. If anyone could cure the human mind, it was him. And so, the funding poured in. From hospitals. From universities. And, quietly, from places the public would never imagine, agencies whose interests went far beyond healing. Audio cue, typewriter keys clacking, intercut with faint military radio static. The early 1950s were not just the age of medicine. They were the age of fear. The Cold War had begun. Governments around the world were terrified of one thing: control. If the enemy could control minds, manipulate behavior, break loyalty, what could stop them? And so, when Dr. Cameron claimed he could erase and rewrite the human psyche, intelligence agencies listened. They saw not therapy, but opportunity. Narrator, V.O. Officially, his work was about curing depression, trauma, and schizophrenia. Unofficially, it became the perfect cover for experiments that crossed every ethical line imaginable. Fade in, black screen, text appears, experiment number 1, patient M. One of his first patients was a woman named Margaret, a young mother struggling with postpartum depression. She was bright, articulate, gentle, someone who believed deeply in science. When her family suggested therapy, she hesitated, but the institute promised a safe, compassionate environment. The brochures used words like comfort, recovery, and new life. She never imagined that new life meant erasing the old one. On her first day, she was given pills she couldn't identify. Then injections. She was told they would help her sleep, that rest was essential to recovery. She awoke in a white room, bound at the wrists, with wires attached to her temples. Sound cue, slow electric hum, heartbeat monitor. Dr. Cameron observed quietly from behind a glass window. To him, this was not cruelty, it was science. Every patient was data, every scream a signal. His theory was simple: if he could completely erase a person's learned responses, wipe out their memories and personality, he could rebuild them from zero. To Cameron, this was the birth of a miracle. To Margaret, it was the beginning of disappearance. Beat, narration slows, solemn tone. For weeks, she was sedated, shocked, and isolated. When she tried to ask questions, nurses reminded her, "Doctor knows best." When she begged to leave, she was told, "You're not ready yet." In Cameron's eyes, the patient's suffering wasn't tragedy. It was progress. He believed pain was proof that the old self was dying, and that meant the treatment was working. Cut to archival note, Stage 2, Psychic Driving. Repetition. 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 Once a patient's resistance was broken, Cameron played recorded messages on loops for days. Sometimes affirmations like, "You are safe. You are loved." Sometimes commands, "You will obey. You will forget." The messages were meant to overwrite the human mind, like replacing a corrupted file. But what happens when you delete too much? Static noise builds slowly, then silence. When Margaret finally woke from one of the sessions, she didn't know where she was. She didn't recognize her husband. She couldn't remember her own children. Her memories, the essence of her, were gone. The doctors smiled. They said, "It's working." Narrator, V.O. Outside those hospital walls, the world saw progress, articles praising bold psychiatric innovation. Inside, the staff saw hollow eyes staring from hospital beds, repeating phrases like broken records. To the doctors, it was data. To the patients, it was obliteration. Soft piano fades in, camera pans over cold hospital window. In Cameron's notebooks, there was no sign of guilt. He wrote about the exhilaration of discovering that identity could be reshaped. That human consciousness itself could be a project. But buried between his notes on voltage, sleep cycles, and drug combinations was one sentence that would later haunt investigators: total depatterning may be irreversible in some subjects, the personality may not return. And then, beneath it, circled twice, acceptable loss. Music drops to silence. Cameron believed he had found a new frontier, not of medicine, but of control. He had given birth to a miracle, yes, but it was one built on erased souls. The public still believed he was healing people. They didn't know that, behind those white walls, patients were being turned into experiments. Long pause, faint ticking of clock. And for those who entered the Allen Memorial Institute, few would ever walk out the same again. They called it the treatment ward. Patients called it the White Room. A place where the world outside ceased to exist, and where time dissolved into an endless blur of light, sound, and silence. Camera slowly pans across a sterile room, a narrow bed, metal restraints, a speaker fixed above the headboard. For Margaret, it began like any other hospital stay. She was told to rest, to trust the process, to let the therapy do its work. But the longer she stayed, the more the walls seemed to close in, not metaphorically, but physically. The rooms were sealed. The windows fogged from the inside. She wasn't allowed visitors. Letters went unanswered. And somewhere in the hallways, she could hear it, the voices. At first, she thought they were real. Soft murmurs behind the door, whispering the same phrases again and again. But when she asked the nurses, they only smiled politely and said, "That's part of your treatment, dear." Sound cue, faint looped voice through a speaker, "You are calm. You are safe. You are calm. You are safe." Hours turned into days. Days into weeks. Sleep came and went in chemical waves. Every few hours, the orderlies would arrive, carrying syringes and cloth restraints. There were no clocks, no mirrors, no calendars. Only the constant, inescapable repetition of the voice. Narrator, V.O. This was the heart of Dr. Cameron's experiment, psychic driving. A technique designed to reprogram the mind by forcing it to listen to carefully crafted messages, thousands of times over, until all resistance broke down. To him, it was science. To his patients, it was madness. Camera cuts to archival notes, subject exposure, 16 hours continuous loop, 21 days consecutive. Emotional response minimal. The recordings varied. Some were gentle, soothing mantras about self-worth and safety. Others were more invasive, commands to forget, to obey, to submit. Cameron believed that by flooding the subconscious, he could overwrite memories and rewire behavior. But he was wrong. Instead of creating new selves, he was erasing old ones, and leaving empty shells behind. Distant scream echoes down corridor. The hum of a shock machine fades in. Every few days, Margaret was subjected to treatments. A mild electrical current, they said, just enough to stimulate healing. But it wasn't mild. It wasn't healing. Electrodes were placed on her temples. The voltage increased session after session. When she convulsed, orderlies held her down. When she woke, she didn't remember falling asleep. The shocks were followed by sedation, barbiturates, tranquilizers, LSD. She would drift in and out of consciousness, trapped between dreams and reality. The white ceiling became the only constant, an unending blank canvas staring back at her. Narrator, V.O. The idea was to wipe the slate clean. To destroy everything that made a person who they were, so the doctor could rebuild them from zero. Cameron's notes described it clinically, stage 3, complete depatterning. He wrote about his subjects like machines. Subject displays signs of personality disintegration. Progress excellent. But behind those sterile words were real people, mothers, fathers, daughters. Each one trapped inside the white rooms, their memories unraveling like loose thread. Soft piano melody begins, slow, mournful. Margaret began losing fragments of herself. Her handwriting changed. She forgot faces. She forgot how to read. Eventually, she forgot her own name. The nurses would whisper it to her, "Margaret, you're doing so well." But the name no longer meant anything. It was a sound. A noise. Someone else's story. When family members came to visit, they were turned away. The staff said, "She's not ready yet. The treatment isn't complete." And behind the locked doors, Margaret sat in silence, listening to the same loop play over and over, "You are calm. You are calm. You are calm." Loop overlaps itself, distortion building until it's unbearable. Outside, the Institute continued to receive awards, grants, and glowing media coverage. Cameron was hailed as a visionary. His research was presented at conferences. Papers praised his groundbreaking work on the reconstruction of the psyche. Narrator, V.O. But the data was false. The reports were polished. The truth, the crying, the blank stares, the human cost, was locked away in the basement. Cut to dark file room, shelves of unlabeled tapes, dust floating in light beams. Cameron filmed many of his sessions. But not for compassion, for observation. He wanted to see the moment when the human mind gave up, when the light went out of the eyes, when identity ceased to exist. The footage, decades later, would horrify investigators. In one reel, a patient stares blankly into the camera. Her face slack. Her mouth twitching. The nurse off-screen repeats softly, "She's calm now." Silence. The piano fades out. Inside the white room, time meant nothing. Patients were kept for months, even years. When they finally emerged, many had to relearn how to speak, how to walk, how to eat. Some never recovered. Some never remembered they had been there at all. And through it all, the man behind it, calm, composed, convinced he was doing good, wrote in his notebook, further success anticipated with complete depatterning. To him, these people weren't victims. They were proof. Sound cue, ticking clock grows louder, suddenly stops. There were whispers among the staff, quiet fear, unease. Some nurses resigned. Others stayed silent, bound by loyalty or fear. One would later confess, we told ourselves it was science. That it was helping. But deep down, we knew, something holy was being broken. Camera pans back to the hallway, endless, sterile, doors shut tight. The white room was supposed to be a place of healing. But it became a factory of forgetting. Every session brought Margaret closer to erasure. And somewhere in the sterile silence, a thought began to form, faint, desperate, but alive, they're trying to make me disappear. Long pause, muffled heartbeat. When Cameron walked through the halls, patients flinched. Not because of cruelty, but because of what he represented, the authority of medicine, unquestionable, absolute. He would smile gently, speak kindly, ask how they were feeling. And every time, the answer was the same, I don't know. Narrator, V.O., whispering by the time Margaret's treatment ended, she was not the same woman who entered those doors. Her memories were gone. Her identity, rewritten. The doctors celebrated her progress. But no one could answer the question, who was she now? Soft ambient tone returns, light flickers overhead. The white room had done its job. The experiment was a success. A human mind had been erased. And somewhere in a locked cabinet, Cameron wrote one final note, subject achieved total depatterning. Further testing recommended. Music swells low, cello, heartbeats sink. Narrator, V.O., dark tone. What he didn't know, or perhaps didn't care, was that the real experiment had just begun. Because outside those walls, others were watching. Taking notes. And waiting for their turn. In the years following World War II, the world was obsessed with memory, and with how to control it. Governments, scientists, and military strategists all wanted the same thing, a way to erase trauma, implant loyalty, and reshape the human mind. To them, the human brain wasn't sacred. It was territory. A new battlefield. Montage of 1950s laboratories, white coats, military insignia, and Cold War newsreels. The science of forgetting began with good intentions, or so they said. Doctors claimed they wanted to heal soldiers haunted by war. Psychiatrists promised to cure depression, anxiety, and addiction. But behind that polished language was something far darker, a desire to find out how much of a person could be erased before they stopped being human. And no one pursued that question more ruthlessly than Dr. Ewan Cameron. After his so-called success at the Allen Memorial Institute, Cameron's research drew international attention. His theories on depatterning and psychic driving were seen as revolutionary. He wasn't just a doctor now, he was a pioneer standing on the edge of a terrifying discovery. But he wasn't working alone. Because far away, across the border, a secret organization had been watching him for years. Sound cue, faint teletype clicking, subject Cameron, progress promising. Narrator, V.O., that organization was the CIA. In the early 1950s, America was gripped by paranoia. Communism, nuclear war, brainwashing, these weren't just ideas, they were obsessions. The Korean War had introduced a new kind of fear, captured soldiers returning home, seemingly reprogrammed by enemy nations. To the CIA, it meant one thing, the Soviets had cracked the code of the human mind. And if America didn't catch up, it would be left defenseless. Audio clip recreation, archival-style male voice, we must explore all avenues of mind control. Thus began Project Bluebird, then Project Artichoke, and finally, the most infamous of all, MKUltra. A sprawling network of experiments spanning hospitals, prisons, universities, and psychiatric wards across North America. The mission: to master the mechanics of thought, memory, and obedience. The goal: to create a controllable human being. Camera pans over declassified documents stamped "Top Secret." The CIA needed researchers, credible ones, with academic reputations and access to vulnerable subjects. And that's where Cameron came in. They funded his work through a front organization known as the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. To the public, it sounded harmless, an academic body studying psychology. In reality, it was a pipeline for covert government money, feeding research into mind control. Cameron had no idea, or perhaps didn't care, where the funding came from. He had a vision: to erase the human mind and rebuild it from nothing. And the CIA had the same dream, only for very different reasons. Archival cue, static, male voice, behavioral modification may have intelligence applications. Narrator: V.O. Inside CIA headquarters, scientists debated the limits of the human brain. Could you make someone forget their life? Could you erase loyalty? Could you implant false memories, or create obedience through trauma? To them, it wasn't horror, it was strategy. In their memos, words like depatterning, psychic driving, and sensory isolation became code for psychological warfare. The human mind became a weapon to be studied, tested, and, if necessary, destroyed. Sound: pages flipping, clock ticking louder. Meanwhile, in Montreal, Cameron continued his clinical trials. The CIA sent more money. The institute expanded. More patients were admitted, ordinary men and women, unaware they were part of a covert experiment. Their names would later appear in court cases, but at the time, they were numbers, subjects, case files, test material. One woman was treated for postpartum depression. Another for mild anxiety. A young man simply came seeking therapy for exam stress. None of them consented to what was about to happen. They were sedated, shocked, and looped into oblivion, all under the pretense of medical care. Echoed voice: you are calm. You are safe. For the CIA, this data was gold. Cameron's results promised something they could use: a formula for psychological breakdown and reconstruction. They didn't care about the ethics. They cared about the method: how to erase a person's identity so completely that new ideas could be planted like seeds in an empty field. Narrator: V.O. One declassified memo later read: experiments in depatterning offer promising avenues for interrogation and indoctrination. In simple terms, if you could erase a prisoner's memory, you could make them believe anything. Slow fade, projector whirring, then silence. But there was a problem. Cameron's successes weren't reproducible. The patients didn't come back obedient, they came back broken. Their minds weren't blank slates, they were shattered mirrors. Still, the CIA saw potential. They took his data and replicated the methods elsewhere, in secret facilities, in foreign prisons, even on soldiers. Experiments spread from Canada to the United States, and eventually, across the ocean. Everywhere the same question echoed: how far can you push the human mind before it stops being human? Distorted audio, heartbeat mixed with Morse code. By the 1960s, whispers of MKUltra began leaking out. Reporters caught fragments: unexplained hospital funding, missing records, destroyed documents. But it wasn't until the 1970s, after the Watergate scandal, that the truth began to surface. When the CIA was forced to open its archives, the world was horrified. Project MKUltra wasn't a myth. It was real. And it had touched thousands of lives. Audio montage, congressional hearings, flashbulbs, public outrage. Dr. Cameron was already dead by then. He died before the investigation began, never facing a single charge. But his victims were still alive, some still institutionalized, others struggling to remember who they once were. They began to speak out. Slowly, painfully, they pieced together the fragments of their missing years. They remembered the voices, the lights, the white rooms. And they discovered that their suffering had been part of something far bigger than one man's ambition. Somber piano fades in. Narrator, V.O. Quietly, it wasn't just about one hospital. It was about a system, a machine that turned human memory into a weapon. A collaboration between doctors who wanted to heal and governments that wanted to control. Cameron believed he was erasing pain. The CIA believed they were erasing weakness. But what they really erased was humanity itself. Long pause, typewriter key slams shut. Tape reel stopped spinning. The science of forgetting had reached perfection. And in its reflection, the world saw something terrifying, that evil doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a gun. Sometimes, it wears a white coat. Silence, then faint heartbeat sound returns. Because once you learn how to erase a mind, you learn something even more dangerous. The file was supposed to be destroyed. That's what the official record said. But in a government warehouse outside Washington, a single box survived. Its label was faded, the ink bleeding through decades of dust and humidity. One word still legible across the front, subproject. Inside were fragments, half-burned memos, chemical supply orders, patient codes, invoices written in the names of fake research foundations. It didn't look like history. It looked like a cover-up that failed to finish the job. Narrator, V.O. In 1975, the United States Senate created the Church Committee, a special investigative body tasked with exposing abuses by the intelligence community. Most people expected stories of wiretaps and espionage. What they didn't expect was a trail that led straight into hospital wards. Sound design, soft echo of a gavel striking wood, cameras clicking, voices murmuring in a congressional hall. When the hearings began, a handful of journalists pieced together something extraordinary, whispers of a secret project that tested drugs and psychological techniques on unwitting subjects. A code name kept reappearing, MKUltra. The more they dug, the stranger it became. There were references to universities, to front companies, even to foreign hospitals. None of it made sense, until the survivors came forward. They were older now, their memories foggy, but the details were unmistakable. The white rooms. The voices repeating messages. The electric jolts. The dreams that didn't feel like dreams. One woman testified, her hands trembling as she read from an old diary. They said it was for my depression. I woke up 3 months later. My husband said I'd forgotten our children's names. Soft pause, the hum of old fluorescent lights. These testimonies didn't sound like conspiracy. They sounded like trauma. The committee demanded documentation, but most of it was gone, shredded on the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms years earlier, right before the story broke. Only 20,000 pages survived by accident, misfiled financial records that no one had noticed. They became known as the Ghost Files. Narrator, V.O. Forensic analysts reconstructed them piece by piece. They found payments to hospitals, grants to psychologists, and shipments of unmarked pharmaceuticals. But buried within the paperwork were letters, handwritten, direct, and coldly polite. One from Cameron himself: further funding is requested to continue depatterning subjects exhibiting resistance. Another from a CIA liaison: subject response satisfactory. Recommend extended testing. Each line was like an echo from a forgotten laboratory, proof that what survivors described wasn't imagination, it was evidence. Sound cue, paper being unfolded, faint heartbeat rising. The Ghost Files revealed more than the world was ready to see. They detailed subprojects involving LSD, sleep deprivation, electroshock, and sensory isolation. Experiments on prisoners, mental patients, addicts, even soldiers, all without consent. One memo referred to terminal cases. Another to non-volunteers. A third simply stated, no further inquiry. To the investigators, the pattern was unmistakable: this wasn't a few rogue scientists. It was systemic. Soft piano begins, solemn. But the hardest part wasn't proving what had happened, it was convincing the public to believe it. Because what the files described sounded impossible, a government funding mind control experiments in psychiatric hospitals, carried out by doctors who were supposed to heal. So the survivors told their stories again. They showed the scars from electroshock. They produced medical records, therapy notes, family testimonies. And slowly, the world began to listen. A reporter from the Montreal Star described the first time she visited one of the victims. She kept calling me by the wrong name. Then she'd stop mid-sentence and apologize. Her memory came and went like the flicker of a dying light bulb. Audio transition, faint typewriter clicks, overlapping radio broadcasts. The Canadian government denied involvement. The CIA issued statements that experiments were of limited scope. But the paper trail told another story. Cameron's hospital had been directly funded through front agencies. U.S. dollars had paid for treatments that erased Canadian citizens' identities. The outrage was immediate. Families demanded justice. Lawsuits followed. But the legal path was treacherous, decades had passed, and evidence was missing. Many of the survivors couldn't even remember what was done to them. And that, ironically, was the most horrifying part. Narrator, V.O., how do you prove a crime when the very purpose of that crime was to erase your memory of it? Slow ambient tone, the creak of old film reel. In the late 1980s, a small group of survivors, most of them women, joined forces to file a class action lawsuit against both the CIA and the Canadian government. They were represented by a quiet, determined attorney named Alan Stein, who once said, "These people weren't just patients. They were victims of a war they never agreed to fight." The legal battle dragged on for years. The government stonewalled, citing national security. But in 1992, after relentless pressure, several victims finally received compensation. It wasn't much, barely enough to cover their medical bills. But for them, it wasn't about money. It was about being believed. Beat, soft sigh of relief, followed by static crackle. The ghost files forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth: the boundary between medicine and manipulation had been crossed, not by monsters, but by men who believed they were doing good. In one Senate transcript, a senator asked a simple question: if this could happen once, what's to stop it from happening again? No one answered. Music shifts, slow, minor chords. The documents that survived were later declassified. They're now stored in the National Archives, boxes of fragile paper, open to the public. Anyone can read them. Few do. Because what they describe isn't history, it's a mirror. Every page feels like a whisper from the past, reminding us how easily moral lines blur when science serves power. One memo ends with a single phrase, typed in neat capital letters: subject unable to recall. Procedure successful. Pause, silence, only the hum of a projector running out of film. Narrator, V.O., quietly 4 decades, those words defined hundreds of stolen lives. And though the files were finally found, the people inside them remained ghosts, walking reminders of what happens when progress forgets compassion. Sound, heartbeat fading into distance, faint echo of a woman's voice: "I just wanted help." Some of them would live the rest of their lives trying to rebuild what was taken. Others wouldn't even know what they'd lost. The Ghost Files closed the chapter on one of history's darkest scientific pursuits. But as the world turned the page, something unsettling lingered, because buried in those same archives were new proposals, new experiments, new budgets waiting for approval. Final line delivered with slow, haunting clarity. The files may have been uncovered. But the science of forgetting was far from over. Fade to black. Subtle tape reel stop clicks. It was supposed to end with the Ghost Files. That's what everyone believed, that exposure meant closure, that the world had learned its lesson. But history has a way of repeating itself, especially when it hides behind new technology. Narrator, V.O. In the decades after the MKUltra scandal, the world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. The Cold War faded, computers replaced filing cabinets, and surveillance moved from laboratories to living rooms. The white coats were gone, but the same obsession remained: control the mind, control the world. Sound design, faint modem dial tone, electric crackle, soft hum of a computer booting up. By the 1990s, governments no longer needed electrodes and hospital wards. They had something far more efficient: data. Human behavior could be tracked, catalogued, predicted. And the boundary between psychology and technology began to blur again. What used to require syringes and machines now needed only a screen. A new generation of psychologists started working with intelligence agencies, designing systems that could shape thought on a global scale. Behavioral manipulation didn't look like shock therapy anymore, it looked like advertising, entertainment, and algorithms. But beneath that new surface, the same question that haunted Dr. Cameron's research echoed louder than ever: how do you erase a thought? Soft electronic pulse, shifting tone. The 1990s were an experimental decade, not just for technology, but for social engineering. In hidden research facilities, scientists tested how visual stimuli, repetition, and suggestion could alter memory and belief. They weren't torturing individuals now. They were studying populations. A 1995 report from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, discussed something called information influence. Officially, it was about countering propaganda. Unofficially, it was about creating it. Narrator, V.O. The science of forgetting had evolved. No longer about wiping memories through shock, now it was about overriding them through exposure. Repeated images. Targeted messages. Behavioral feedback loops that nudged thought patterns in predictable directions. The mind, once a battlefield of electricity and chemicals, had become a digital landscape. And every click, every like, every swipe was a tiny experiment. Static dissolves into faint audio snippets, news anchors, commercials, political speeches blending into noise. It wasn't called MKUltra anymore. It didn't need a name. The same techniques that once erased people's identities in hospital beds were now rebranded as behavioral insights, neuromarketing, and cognitive research. Governments weren't the only ones interested anymore, corporations had joined the game. A 2002 internal memo from a tech firm described users as data subjects. Another called them participants in long-term behavioral observation. It was the same language Cameron used 50 years earlier, just dressed in modern vocabulary. Sound, keyboard clacks, digital pings, a mouse click that echoes like a metronome. The irony was cruel: the very science built on human suffering had become the backbone of a trillion-dollar industry. But instead of hospitals, it now lived inside phones, apps, and networks that people carried willingly. No drugs, no straps, no electrodes. Just convenience, and consent hidden in terms and conditions. Narrator, V.O. If Cameron's victims were trapped in padded rooms, today's subjects are trapped in loops, endless cycles of scrolling, viewing, reacting, forgetting. Each action recorded, each hesitation analyzed. The echoes of MKUltra hum beneath the surface of modern life, not in the screams of patience, but in the silence of passive participation. Beat, low mechanical drone builds underneath. Whistleblowers have claimed that intelligence agencies still fund behavioral research today, only now under different names, hidden in cybersecurity budgets and defense innovation grants. They say the same questions never went away. Only the tools changed. One declassified document from 2011 described neural feedback models designed to predict emotional reactions to visual content in real time. Another proposed adaptive psychological conditioning through media exposure. The goal? To guide the public toward desired outcomes without them ever realizing it. It sounded like science fiction. But then again, so did MKUltra, until the ghost files proved it was real. Sound, rhythmic pulse of data packets traveling through cables. In 2013, when Edward Snowden revealed the extent of global digital surveillance, the world got another glimpse into how far the system had evolved. The technology wasn't just collecting information, it was shaping it. Search results adjusted. Feeds tailored. Realities personalized. And with every adjustment came a subtle erasure, not of memory this time, but of truth itself. Narrator, V.O. In the 1950s, they wanted to make people forget their lives. Now, they make people forget what's real. Quiet pause, faint ticking of a clock. Psychologists call it collective depatterning. When constant exposure to fragmented information leaves people unable to distinguish fact from fiction. Confusion becomes compliance. And in that confusion, control thrives. One neuroscientist, speaking off record, admitted, "We've built the perfect depatterning machine. People volunteer for it." Soft mechanical sigh, digital hum intensifies. The parallels are haunting. Cameron's subjects were told it was for their own good, that it would help them heal. Today, people are told the same thing about technology, that it connects, informs, and entertains. But both promise the same illusion, comfort through control. Narrator, V.O. The science of forgetting never disappeared. It just changed mediums. From electrodes to algorithms. From the asylum to the internet. And as the world grows more dependent on the systems built to study us, the line between therapy and manipulation blurs once again. Distorted radio static, whisper of overlapping voices, social media notifications, news snippets, advertisements. The old ghosts whisper through the wires, their echoes hidden in code, in data streams, in predictive models that know us better than we know ourselves. We think we're free because we can choose. But every choice is guided, every preference recorded, every hesitation stored. The experiment never stopped, it simply scaled. Music builds, slow, haunting electronic pulse. One former intelligence researcher, now retired, once said in an interview, "The best mind control is the kind that looks like free will." Beat, silence, then the faint sound of data transmission fading away. And maybe that's the final evolution of Cameron's vision, not to erase what we remember, but to decide what we believe. Narrator, V.O. Whispering in the hum of our machines, the flicker of our screens, and the patterns we can't stop repeating, his experiment still lives. Long pause. The static fades into silence. Because somewhere between science and power, between curiosity and cruelty, the world learned how to perfect the oldest trick of all, making us forget that we're being watched. Fade to black, a single modem beep echoes, then cuts. The first time she heard the tapes, she didn't recognize her own voice. It trembled, cracked, pleaded, a stranger inside her own skin. For decades, those sounds had been sealed away in government archives. And when they were finally released, fragments of her identity came rushing back like ghosts clawing through static. Her name was Linda MacDonald, one of Dr. Ewan Cameron's forgotten patients from the Allen Memorial Institute. In the 1950s, she entered the hospital for mild postpartum depression. When she left, she couldn't read, write, or remember her children's names. Her life had been erased, one electric surge at a time. Soft, echoing hum, like hospital lights buzzing in an empty corridor. For years, Linda lived in silence, piecing her world together one memory at a time. Her husband told her she'd been treated by the most respected psychiatrist in Canada. She believed him, until the truth began to leak, decades later, through declassified documents and investigative reports. Narrator, V.O. The victims of MKUltra were scattered across decades and continents, their stories buried under layers of redaction and denial. But as survivors began to find each other, they realized they weren't isolated cases. They were evidence. In the 1980s, a small group of them formed what became known as the Survivors Coalition. They met in living rooms, community centers, and church basements, piecing together fragments of memory, trying to understand what had been done to them. Sound, murmurs, the rustle of old papers, a tape recorder clicking on. They compared symptoms, memory loss, night terrors, sudden bursts of panic triggered by sounds or smells. Many had identical gaps in their past, days, sometimes months, simply gone. Each story, though unique, carried the same structure: admission for minor issues, then disappearance into what was called deep therapy. But the deeper they dug, the more horrifying the pattern became. One survivor recalled hearing the same recorded phrase played on loop for days: "You are not you anymore." Another remembered waking up restrained, her body covered in electrodes, while a voice repeated, "Your mind is clean. You will obey." Echo of the voice blends into sound design, looping whispers, indistinct but rhythmic. These weren't healing sessions. They were reprogramming experiments, funded by the CIA, approved by Canadian intelligence, and justified under the banner of scientific advancement. By 1990, the survivors decided to fight back. They filed a lawsuit against both the U.S. and Canadian governments, demanding acknowledgement and compensation for what had been done. Narrator, V.O., the courtroom became their new battleground. But instead of electrodes and isolation, the weapons now were bureaucracy, denial, and delay. Sound, shuffle of papers, courtroom ambience, distant echo of a gavel. Government lawyers argued that too much time had passed, that the records were incomplete, that the funding had been indirect. But the survivors had something more powerful than evidence: they had each other. One of them, Jean Steele, brought a faded photograph of herself before the treatment, smiling, vibrant, full of life. Then she held up another picture, taken after, blank eyes, frail frame, a face emptied of recognition. That single comparison silenced the room. The media began to take notice. Headlines read, "The Canadian Mind Control Experiments" and "CIA's Forgotten Victims." For the first time, the public saw the human cost behind the classified files. Soft piano note, melancholy, reflective. The survivors' testimonies became the foundation of documentaries, books, and investigative series. But with every story told, there came a deeper pain, because telling the truth meant reliving it. One survivor, during a television interview, broke down mid-sentence. Through tears, she whispered, "They stole the sound of my mother's voice. I can't remember it anymore." Her words echoed across the room, hollow and raw, a single line that captured what the documents never could: the death of self. Narrator, V.O., the legal battle stretched for years. Many of the original plaintiffs died before the case concluded. Some couldn't even remember they were part of it. In 1992, a partial settlement was finally reached. But justice, like memory, came too late. The governments involved admitted no wrongdoing. They expressed regret, not responsibility. And even as compensation was distributed, the documents remained heavily redacted, names blacked out, dates missing, context erased. It was, in many ways, another act of depatterning. Another layer of forgetting. Sound, pen scratching on paper, slow ticking of a clock. Yet despite the system's attempts to bury them, the survivors refused to vanish. Some turned their trauma into activism. They spoke at universities, human rights conventions, and psychiatric reform panels. Their message was simple: what happened once can happen again. One survivor, during a 2003 interview, said, "They called us experiments. But we were people. We still are." Her voice trembled but didn't break. Behind her eyes was a fire, the kind that only burns after everything else has been taken away. Soft swelling of ambient sound, like wind moving through old halls. Today, only a handful of those original patients remain alive. Many live quietly, away from cameras and headlines. But their legacy endures, not in the scientific journals that erased them, but in the stories they forced into the light. Their courage exposed not just one program, but an entire mindset, the belief that human minds are just systems to be rewritten. And though their memories were fragmented, their voices became whole again through solidarity. Narrator, V.O. For every erased file, there's a survivor who remembers just enough. For every destroyed tape, there's a voice that refuses to be silenced. Beat, faint heartbeat sound under the narration. In 2017, a small museum exhibition in Montreal opened a new section titled, The Voices We Tried to Forget. Behind a glass panel sat an old reel-to-reel recorder, one of Cameron's actual devices. When played, it emitted a faint hiss, followed by a woman's whisper. It was Linda's voice. Faint, fragile, but still there. The same voice Cameron had tried to erase. The hiss grows louder, then fades into a soft hum, like breath returning to lungs. Her story, once buried in classified reports, now plays on loop, but this time, by choice. Not to erase, but to remember. Narrator, V.O. Softly, maybe that's the final victory. That their voices, once tools of control, became instruments of truth. That memory, once stolen, found a way to echo through time, defying every silence built to contain it. Music swells, slow, emotional crescendo. Because no matter how deep the darkness, no matter how many files are burned, a single voice that refuses to forget can still be heard, like a frequency that never dies. Long pause, faint static, then the sound of a tape ending with a soft click. The files arrived in a plain manila envelope, no return address, no explanation. Inside were photocopied memos, fragments of lab reports, and a single photograph of a man in a white coat standing beside a black metal chair. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, were the words, Experiment 84A, completed. For decades, journalists and researchers had tried to piece together what really happened at the Allen Memorial Institute. But every trail ended in redactions, shredded archives, or sudden silence. Until now. The documents were part of a new wave of declassifications, files once buried deep in the archives of both the CIA and Canadian Defense Research. And they revealed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Soft hum of static, paper rustling, like ghosts trapped in documents. These papers confirmed that what was once called therapy wasn't an isolated project, it was part of a much larger network. A pattern that stretched across borders, under code names like MKUltra, MK Naomi, and Subproject 68. Each with its own focus, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, drug-induced compliance, psychological conditioning. But they all shared one principle, control through erasure. Narrator, V.O. It wasn't about healing minds. It was about breaking them, rebuilding them in ways useful to power. One memo, dated 1957, read, Complete depatterning of personality achieved through repetition and isolation. Subject now displays total dependency and compliance. Recommend further application for interrogation models. The handwriting at the bottom bore Cameron's initials. Beat, eerie silence. For years, researchers had assumed that the CIA simply funded Cameron's work as part of their Cold War paranoia, a desperate attempt to understand brainwashing. But these newly uncovered files told a more chilling story. Cameron wasn't just a participant. He was a model architect. His methods became the blueprint for subsequent behavioral experiments worldwide. From covert prisons in Europe to psychological testing in military facilities, traces of Cameron's psychic driving theory could be found, renamed, repackaged, repurposed. It wasn't therapy that spread. It was the method of control. Low drone builds, sound of typewriter clacking rhythmically, echoing heartbeat-like. One internal CIA review noted, results from Montreal indicate successful pattern erasure via environmental deprivation and recorded suggestion. High potential for adaptation in interrogation settings. And suddenly, the connection became undeniable. The same tactics that destroyed the minds of patients in hospital beds would later resurface in interrogation manuals, psychological warfare programs, and even modern black site operations. The therapy had evolved into something global. Narrator, history didn't bury Cameron's legacy. It disguised it. As journalists traced these connections, another revelation emerged: the financial trail. Cameron's funding came through front organizations with vague names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Behind that facade, the CIA. And behind the CIA, the Cold War's most dangerous ambition: to own the human mind. Music shifts, slow, pulsing bass. But the deeper the investigation went, the stranger it became. Because buried within these files were references to experiments that extended beyond psychiatry, into behavior prediction, social control, and media influence. Projects that studied not just individuals, but entire populations. Documents mentioned a term that seemed oddly out of place in the 1950s: pattern induction through mass messaging. Researchers speculated it was the earliest reference to psychological conditioning through information, the primitive seed of what we now call psychological operations. Narrator, Cameron had wanted to control one mind. But his sponsors dreamed of controlling millions. Static rising, layered whispers overlapping faintly, as if voices from old recordings. In one interview, an anonymous intelligence official admitted, "We were trying to find a switch in the brain. But eventually, we realized the switch wasn't inside the skull. It was outside, in the environment, in the words people heard, in what they believed." That chilling realization reframed everything. What started as electrodes and sedatives in a quiet hospital ward became a model for soft control, manipulation not through pain, but through information. Sound fades, faint ticking, like a metronome. By the early 2000s, investigative journalists discovered that many of Cameron's unpublished notes had been digitized by research foundations under the guise of historical preservation. Among them were sketches of new apparatuses, annotated brainwave charts, and a chilling phrase scrawled across a notebook margin: "Memory is malleable. Identity is programmable." The handwriting was unmistakable. And then, a discovery that changed everything. In a forgotten box from the Allen Institute's basement archives, researchers found an audio reel labeled "Pattern Continuation." When restored and played, it contained a voice, deep, distorted, mechanical. The voice repeated a message every 30 seconds, the experiment was not a failure. The experiment never ended. The line echoes 3 times, the sound thick with reverb. That was the moment the story turned from history to horror. Narrator, if the experiment never ended, where did it go? Some pointed to the continued use of psychological warfare tactics in modern intelligence training. Others to the subtle design of mass persuasion through advertising, social media, and algorithmic feeds. Every pattern, every repeated message, every psychological test, all echoed fragments of Cameron's original theories. The same language of suggestion, conditioning, and depatterning lived on, rebranded, modernized, and scaled to billions. Whispers fade into the sound of modern keyboard typing, distant city ambience. In a strange, haunting way, the survivors' erased minds had become a prototype for a digital society constantly shaped by repetition, fed curated realities, nudged by invisible algorithms, driven by emotional triggers. Cameron's voice was gone. But his concept, the dream of total behavioral predictability, had become the unseen architecture of the modern world. Music swells, eerie and solemn. In 2019, a journalist named Eleanor Hayes published a final exposé connecting the dots between MKUltra and the data manipulation models used in modern behavioral analytics. Her article ended with a single line that sent chills across readers worldwide: "We are all subjects now." And in that moment, the meaning of the final pattern became clear. It was never about one doctor, one institute, or one era. It was about an idea, that control could be perfected, and the human mind could be engineered like a machine. The hum of fluorescent lights has been replaced by the quiet buzz of digital screens. The padded walls of the Allen Memorial Institute are gone, but their spirit, their architecture of control, seems eerily familiar. Only now, the walls are invisible. Each morning, billions of people wake up, reach for their phones, and plug themselves into the modern experiment, one without electrodes, without sedatives, without physical restraints. Yet somehow, it works even better. Soft sound design, the faint buzz of notifications, typing, digital pings echoing like a heartbeat. What began as psychic driving through looping tapes has evolved into algorithmic conditioning, endless scrolling, repeated content, curated emotions. Every like, every swipe, every pause becomes data, small signals that feed the system's understanding of who we are and what keeps us engaged. Narrator, V.O. In the 1950s, they tried to erase and rewrite minds in isolation rooms. Today, we volunteer for it, in exchange for connection. At first, it seems absurd to compare the horrors of MKUltra to social media algorithms or digital influence models. But deep in declassified CIA papers, one line stands out: the most effective conditioning occurs when the subject is unaware that conditioning is taking place. And that's where the connection becomes undeniable. Music, faint mechanical hum layered with heartbeat rhythm. The same psychological principles that guided Cameron's repatterning therapy, repetition, emotional manipulation, and controlled information flow, are now the foundation of the attention economy. Not through electrodes, but through dopamine. Narrator, V.O. Where Cameron once repeated words to erase a mind, algorithms now repeat images to shape it. Every scroll is a microdose of suggestion, a subtle rewiring of perception. Our emotional responses, tracked in real time, guide what appears next. We don't remember the sequence, but the sequence remembers us. The sound of scrolling merges with faint whispers: keep watching, keep scrolling. In a way, Cameron's dream of a programmable mind has become a system that programs itself, machine learning guided by human weakness. And behind the curtain of convenience, there are rooms full of engineers and behavioral scientists, the modern descendants of Cameron's mind architects. Only their goal isn't national security. It's engagement. One former data scientist described his company's mission as optimizing attention. When asked what that meant, he paused before answering: it means learning what keeps you looking, and never letting you go. Pause, faint echo of hospital machines blending into notification chimes. Some researchers call it digital depatterning. The term isn't official, but it's hauntingly appropriate. Every day, we surrender fragments of focus, memory, and individuality to systems designed to homogenize thought, to erase complexity and replace it with predictability. The blank slate that Cameron once created through electroshock is now achieved through overstimulation. Instead of silence, we're drowned in noise, a constant flood of content that numbs reflection. And just like Cameron's patience, most of us don't realize it's happening. Soft, eerie ambience returns, the hum of static under a modern digital tone. Narrator, V.O. In the old experiment, isolation made subjects pliable. In the new one, connection does. We post our thoughts, our emotions, our private fears, feeding the machine that studies us. It learns how we think, what we desire, and what triggers us. It crafts a perfect reflection, then slowly begins to guide that reflection, gently steering us toward predictable patterns of behavior. Sound of hundreds of faint voices merging, like social media chatter dissolving into static. It's not about controlling every person. It's about controlling the collective mood. Just as Cameron experimented with suggestion loops, modern platforms test which messages spread fastest, which emotions ignite response: anger, fear, outrage. The pattern is eerily familiar. Cameron believed that extreme emotion opened the mind to suggestion. So do modern systems, only they've automated it. Every crisis, every trend, every outrage cycle is another loop of psychic driving, amplifying, repeating, until it becomes reality. Sound cue, rising heartbeat under a mechanical pulse. One former intelligence analyst, interviewed anonymously, put it bluntly: the tools we once built to break people in interrogation rooms are now breaking societies, just slower, and prettier. That sentence lingers, heavy, undeniable. The survivors of the original experiments fought for decades to prove their suffering wasn't therapy. But what happens when a new generation willingly enters the chamber? Not of shock and isolation, but of stimulation and distraction. The results are the same: confusion, dependency, emotional fragmentation. Soft piano melody begins, somber, reflective. Perhaps the darkest part of this evolution is that the machine no longer needs a doctor. It doesn't need you and Cameron. It doesn't even need intent. The pattern sustains itself, a feedback loop of data, emotion, and manipulation. It learns what humanity fears, what it loves, what it hates. And it feeds us just enough of each to keep us coming back. Narrator, in the end, control doesn't require cruelty. It only requires convenience. We are the subjects now, wired not through electrodes, but through desire. Every notification is an invitation. Every feed refresh is another repetition of suggestion. The music builds, blending digital tones with faint analog static, bridging eras. If the survivors of the past were haunted by silence, we are haunted by noise. If their memories were erased, ours are overwritten, not through shock, but through endless distraction. And the echo that began in a cold Montreal lab now vibrates through every glowing screen on the planet. Beat, sound of a phone vibrating, then silence. Because Cameron's experiment didn't just reveal how minds can be broken. It revealed how easily they can be guided, how fragile truth becomes when reality itself can be shaped. Maybe that's why, in a strange and terrifying way, we're still inside his machine. The walls are wider, the method subtler, but the echo remains the same. Static fades, replaced by a soft heartbeat sound, steady, distant. There's a peculiar kind of quiet that follows revelation, the kind that doesn't bring peace, only weight. The world keeps spinning, screens keep glowing, but somewhere underneath it all, there's a stillness, a collective forgetting. For the survivors, that silence has always been louder than the screams. Decades after the experiments ended, many of them spent their lives trying to recover fragments of who they once were. But memories, once tampered with, don't return as they were. They come back warped, like light bending through broken glass. Soft sound design, wind through an empty hallway, distant clock ticking. Linda McDonald's voice, once lost in the loops of Cameron's tapes, had become a symbol. Her story had circulated through documentaries and investigative reports. But behind the spotlight was a quieter truth: she still couldn't remember the birth of her first child. No therapy could bring that moment back. Narrator, the price of erasure isn't just what you lose, it's what you can never feel again. As the years passed, survivors became fewer. Each death felt like another page torn from a history book that was already missing half its text. Some left behind journals, pages filled with shaky handwriting, dreams, flashes of sound, the sense of a voice whispering commands that no longer existed. One entry read, "I can't tell which memories are mine and which were given to me." Those words could have been written by any of them, or by all of us. Soft piano enters, delicate, melancholic. In 2005, researchers conducted a neurological study on surviving patients. The scans showed something remarkable, and horrifying. Parts of their brains responsible for autobiographical memory showed abnormal connectivity. It wasn't just trauma. Their minds had been physically rewired. One neurologist described it as architectural damage to the self. He said it like a scientist, but the phrase carried a kind of poetry and tragedy. For the survivors, remembering wasn't the hardest part. Believing what they remembered was. Friends, family, and even doctors often dismissed their accounts as confusion, exaggeration, or delusion. "That can't be true," they said. "No doctor would do that." But he did. And for years, they paid for it, in disbelief, in loneliness, in the silence that followed every retelling. The faint echo of a hospital machine fades in, heartbeat monitor pulsing slowly. Narrator, V.O. It's easier for societies to erase trauma than to confront it. Because remembering demands responsibility. Governments eventually issued partial apologies, statements filled with passive language and diplomatic phrasing. Unfortunate experiments, they called them. But the survivors' pain was never unfortunate. It was deliberate. Their lawsuit settlements came with non-disclosure clauses. Money for silence. The same system that once erased their minds now erased their voices. One survivor refused the payout. Her name was withheld in all official reports, but her interview in a 1998 documentary captured something raw, a truth too jagged to be scripted. She said, through trembling lips, "They wanted us to forget. And they got what they wanted. But I remember enough to never forgive." Beat, silence, only her words hanging in the air. Memory, as psychologists say, is not a recording, it's reconstruction. But what happens when the foundation is scorched? What happens when you're told that the fragments left inside your head, the voices, the flashes of light, the repeated phrases, were for your own good? That kind of manipulation leaves something worse than trauma. It leaves doubt. And doubt corrodes everything it touches, identity, love, even the concept of truth itself. Slow ambient hum returns, low, steady, like the sound of static breathing. Over time, society moved on. The name Ewan Cameron faded from headlines and entered history books as a cautionary footnote. But beneath the academic language, depatterning therapy, psychic driving, experimental psychiatry, the real meaning remained the same: cruelty disguised as science. And in a strange twist of fate, the very same institutions that once enabled him continued to fund research into neural plasticity, memory suppression, and emotional modulation. Different terminology. Same pursuit. Control. Narrator, V.O. The more we study memory, the closer we come to altering it. And that should terrify us. Because the silence of memory isn't just about forgetting the past, it's about losing the ability to tell when forgetting has begun. Sound cue, faint rewind effect, like an old tape spinning backward. In 2019, a research team in Boston announced a successful experiment. They'd managed to weaken specific traumatic memories in lab mice through targeted neural stimulation. Headlines called it a breakthrough in trauma therapy. But those who knew history felt a chill run through them. The language was too familiar. Erasure. Relief. Control. One survivor's daughter, now a journalist herself, wrote an op-ed that went viral: "My mother's memory was stolen in the name of progress. Now we're calling it innovation."